projecting. What we've done is transferred 30 teacher FTEs over to Title II-A for class size reduction, and that saved the general fund about $2 million. And then we're also doing a one-time increase in Title I indirect cost of an additional $2 million that will help fund the instructional materials that we have planned for 15-16. Okay, to give you a history of what our general fund budget of expenditures have done over time, you can see that we've kind of varied from year to year. In 12-13, our increase was 4.9%. Then we went down to 3.26%. And then last year was when we did that $21 million in discretionary funds that went out to the buildings. So that caused a 10.73% increase, which is not sustainable with our tax revenues and our state aid funding. So you can't increase the budget that much every year and expect to maintain any kind of fund balance, which we need to have. We're required by law to have a fund balance between 5 and 15%. So we're close to 8% now, and so we need to be building that back up. So what we're proposing for 15-16 after all the changes that we've made is a 3.36% increase. Okay, the way we did the budget development this year, and I really appreciate the principals and the buildings for working with us. They've been very patient and very kind, and as we go through this process, because we were using priority-based budgeting, which is a little bit different than what they were used to, and we actually developed the budgets for them instead of the principals developing the budget and doing it that way. So we had staffing conferences in March and April, and they included the principals, human resource staff, the budget office, and the EDs were all involved in these staffing conferences. So we worked collaboratively to determine the staffing for the buildings, including the classroom size and the section needs. So we got an estimate of what the student population was going to be at each building, so we could figure out classroom sizes and what the section needs were. And in some cases, they didn't need as much staff as they had, and in other cases, they needed more people. So we were working with them to try to figure out what the best fit would be for this coming year for their buildings. In the past, they used discretionary dollars to buy staff, which would be like specialists for like music, PE, art, for planning periods and that type of thing. They used them for instructional facilitators, just a variety of different things. And so what we did in this process is, rather than giving them money for them to add staff and do that type of thing, we actually funded all of the staff that they had in the building. After our conferences, we figured out what they had last year, what they needed for the coming year, and then we staffed it with general fund dollars. So that was a different approach to budgeting than what we've done in the past. We also had increased budgets for the facilities as well. That included, supplies, heating, electricity, sewer, and all of that. So for the facility budget, our total increase was $1.7 million over last year from this year. And most of that had to do with salaries. And we have a total of 360 full-time custodians, and using a 3.5% salary increase, and then also adding custodians for the early learning centers. We had to add a head custodian and a regular custodian. So all of those costs combined caused a $1.2 million increase for facilities. And then we also increased heating and electricity. And what we do is we look at the 3-year trend to see what it's been, to kind of get an estimate of what we need to budget for that. And in some cases, we're just making adjustments to make sure we're following that trend as best we can. So overall, the building increase was $1.7 million. Okay, and I talked about discretionary funds previously, that the past practice was to increase staff time for specialist teachers like art, music, PE, increase para hours for library, office, health, noon paras, that type of thing, in-house printing, dues, supplies, textbooks, all of those things they use their discretionary funds for, and now we've given them that funding in the general fund. So they won't be having as much discretionary funds as they had in the past because it's been provided for in the general fund budget. So now the discretionary money that we've allocated to the buildings, because we're paying for all of these things through the general fund and they're not having to buy or use their discretionary dollars for it, is we've allocated $100 per student to each building. So the total of doing that is about $5 million in discretionary money compared to what they've done in the past. It was closer to, I don't know, 25 million, something like that, 30 million. But now, because we've changed the practice of how we're budgeting, now that discretionary allocation is going to be a little bit less because they're not having to do all these extras like pay for printing and pay for supplies and all of that thing. So some of the budget considerations that we had for instructional expenditure changes was when we met with the principals during the staffing conferences, everybody wanted instructional facilitators. That was something that every school wanted to have and that they were using some of their discretionary funds for. We also provided kindergarten paras because if you're a Tier 1 or Tier 2 school, you get kindergarten paras that are full-time, which is a 7-hour para, and then everybody else got a 5.5 FTE per para. So we completely funded all of that. We funded the library paras, the music teachers, PE, all of that was now paid for in the general fund as an off-formula appropriation. So these were the increases that we had for instructional expenditures. Additional increases were for guidance counselors, guidance paras, ESL and health, nurse aides, technicians, all of those things. So the total off-formula increases for the instructional expenditures was $7 million overall. And that was just a shift in how we're doing our allocations now. Now we had some, once we took care of all the buildings and took care of the salary increases and all of that, then we did budget development for the departments. And we had a budget increase for the transportation vehicle acquisition. There is a cycle that they use for vehicle replacement that they do so many vehicles every year, and we set aside $600,000 out of the general fund and put it in the depreciation fund for the purchase of vehicles. And a bus purchase would be like $50,000 for a bus, so you can't, if you're not setting money aside every year, it's hard to come up with those funds when you need the buses as they age and need to be replaced. We've also budgeted for cameras for the buses, and we have 263 buses in our fleet alone, just the OPS district fleet, and the bus cameras will cost approximately $1,300 per camera to put on the buses. So we've allocated that. We also had miscellaneous transportation expenditures for overtime, dues, that type of thing. Custodial supplies and equipment, we increased it by $49,000. Schoolhouse planning, lease and supplies. We have leases that we budgeted for the middle school SSP program and the CIA site for the transition program. So those were included in the schoolhouse planning and leases. And we talked earlier about the textbook adoption thing where we're getting the writing and the graduation requirement thing. So that's about $4 million. And then for health supplies and licenses and all of that, we budgeted $219,000. And this was based on staffing requests, and then the exec committee met and we talked about each of the requests and decided on what things we were going to fund and what wasn't going to be funded based on what we have to spend, because we are limited on what we have to spend as well. So we have budgeted $510,000 for professional development, and that goes to that special education funding issue that we had with the federal government. We're going to do some professional development in that area. We have to contract for unfilled SLP positions. That's $180,000. We have PT and OT contract for $61,000. Heartland Boys Town contract of $80,000. We have to provide snacks for early childhood students. And then there's a mandate for the PACA, the Affordable Care Act. We needed to contract for services as a requirement of that, and that's going to cost $110,000. We've increased legal fees by $210,000 for mostly OCR complaints and things that have come up, judgments, that type of thing that we've had. And then the PeopleSoft upgrade, I talked earlier, it was about $3 million, but we've shifted some of it over using the depreciation fund and then also using the ESU to pay for part of that PeopleSoft upgrade. We also have increases for the Principals Institute and professional development and workshops, consultants. We've increased FTEs for plan time because we've extended the school day. We needed to get some more FTEs into the buildings to help them with their plan time. We've increased FTEs for the health aides, counselors, the graduation facility rental. Each high school is budgeted to receive $7,000 for graduation facility rental costs and for the printing and stuff they need for the diplomas and so forth. We've increased the special education teachers by 6 FTE, and also the negotiated salary increases was about $883,000. So overall, the department changes for expenditures was $9.2 million. So when you add up all of these increases, so we had for facilities, that increase was about $1.2 million, I believe. No, $1.7 million. And then we had the instructional budget increased by $7 million, and then the department expenditure increases was $9 million. So overall, when you add all of that to what our budget was last year for 14-15, we have net preliminary increases of $18 million. And so that makes our preliminary budget $554 million, and we're estimating $555 million as revenues. So that adds up to be a 3.36% increase in expenditures. So that would be our budget recommendation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about any of this.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Or you're processing? Mr. Wayne?
So, is this the committee's recommendation or is this the application?
Well, we started, in our staffing conferences, and we met with the principals and did all of that. And then we got the department budgets. That's what they were requesting. And then we met in an executive committee, executive council, and then we looked at all of these increases. And then based on our discussions there, we decided what things would be appropriate or not appropriate, what could be cut, and what changes could be made. And so then that became our budget recommendation. And since we met with the executive committee, there's been several changes. As I said, this is kind of a moving document because there are additional things that come up that, oh, we forgot to budget for this, or we didn't budget for that, or whatever. So this is still kind of moving, but so far we're still below the maximum, so that's good, and we want to keep it that way because we need to levy some tax in the building fund and the qualified capital purpose undertaking fund, but this is the general fund portion that we're talking about here for the increase.
I'm just trying to, I don't want to have committee time, just use
I think he's asking if this is a formal recommendation put forth by the budget committee that Luann and I sit on. And I would say, from my perspective, no, we did not make a
The decision.
right. I would say that this
is staff
this is a
recommendation.
presentation
Yeah.
that came out of all of those things that you just said, not a formal recommendation from the committee.
Yeah, this is like a preliminary recommendation to the board, I guess, to see what your thoughts are on it.
I think it's still a living document, so we're still working on it, but we wanted to give the preliminary document to the whole school board, even though I know the budget committee's seen it at least once, maybe just once. So it's still in the works.
And there's still some negotiations that are going on with different employee groups that haven't settled yet. So those are things that will impact this as well. So it's still moving.
So my question, because I'm still trying to understand the priority-based budgeting part of it, and how that aligns with the priorities that we set in our strategic plan, the new ones that we just adopted. I mean, is that, for example, the one that just jumped out at me, just as maybe as a point to start the discussion, was in your meetings, there was you determined an increase in kindergarten paras, that was something that was sort of across the board people. So to align that increase with, does it make sense to try and align that increase with the priorities that we set as a board? And so it's
not.
I'm not trying to take it item by item. I'm just saying, as a jumping off point, how do we align those two things as a board?
Now, this wasn't really an increase in staff. What it is shifting from using discretionary money or other sources, moving it into the general fund so it's provided for them. So it's not like there was.
But we decided to allocate dollars there.
Yeah.
Right, that you initially had not in your until
Right,
you,
because
okay,
they-
right.
yeah.
So it's not necessarily an increase, but it's a decision to say money here instead of here.
Right.
So, and that's what all of these decisions are. So, and again, please this has nothing to do, I want to be very clear with kindergarten paras and with the benefit of them or not. It's just for discussion purposes only and how this aligns with priorities that we set.
So I have a question on that particular piece. For instance, that particular item, where was it funded from before? I mean,
Did you answer?
Sure. Most of it is, the way we had done it in the past was we'd actually given the different schools weighting formulas.
Right.
And with the weighting, they would choose to buy the paras or the kindergarten paras or extra staff. So it's
Okay.
primarily from the weighting piece of it.
so is it actually an increase of 3.8 overall? No, it's just.
A lot of it's shifting.
It's just the bucket that it's coming from.
Correct.
So it's not, and discretionary was in the general fund before.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it was just whether it was budgeted or not budgeted through discretionary, but the dollar amount hasn't changed. The dollar amount is the same
Right.
as in the past?
Right, with the exception
inc-
of salaries, or
Right, with
increases.
the increase in salaries, but it's not a $3.8 million
That's
salary increase, it's just, it's just the way it's appearing in the budget because we took away from making discretionary to saying, okay, you were doing it anyway, we're going to
Correct.
budget for it. Does that help?
Only in understanding where the money comes from. I wish I had never asked about kindergarten paras. Should I just make something up? I mean, I guess I'm talking a more general philosophical discussion about the alignment between where we decide to spend our money and the priorities we set as a district.
Can I jump in? For example, there wasn't an increase in communication, but we've all kind of said that communication needs to be improved across the district. At least I didn't see one up there. So if that's a higher priority for the board, where does that increase or that come from, and how does that reflect, or how does that show up in our budget?
I think there was an increase for communication. It just got combined into these categories. I don't know if you have. If you would like to know the specific increase that we have for that, I can get that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And I guess generally back to what I think Mrs. Fay is saying, that I know this is just a general fund, or there's another bucket and another bucket. I think we probably need to see all buckets together so we know if there is an increase in, i.e. communication or some other area. Because the one that stands out to me is the legal fees, and I got a problem with those being increased, because the purpose of hiring that position was to decrease them, I thought. But I didn't see the same reflection on this general fund for communication, and that I thought was unanimous among the board that was the area we need to improve. So I don't know where that's at, but I'd like to see it.
Okay. We do have a breakdown by building and by department what the increases were, so I can provide you with that, so you have an electronic copy of that, so you know where the increases were going. We didn't drill down and tell you specifically what things were increased, and we can if you'd like to know that, but we can give you by department what the increases were.
This is along the same lines, and maybe this is less about the specific line item, but it's more the trend that we've started setting in a positive way has been beginning to prioritize our priorities and make sure we're transparent with the public around what we're working on, when, specifically year to year.
Right.
And I think what I'm hearing, and this is my interpretation, is this is great when we're a living document, but before we get into a place where we approve it, that there should be a high level alignment to priorities and the changes that you're recommending. This way, when we're sharing with the public, which this doesn't do that yet, this
Right.
is two line item, like alignment to the different priorities or strategies, as general as we can without getting too specific, so that we can communicate this effectively to parents, community, and everybody at large. And we don't have to get so into the weeds where we're asking, well, why are we increasing this? This way, we can share the percent changes year to year and align them with what we're trying to work on.
Sure, we can work on that, and I can have that for you the next work session that we have.
And it would be really helpful is if, when you're collaborating with communications, I want to make sure that this is something that is truly transparent and easily digestible for the community.
Okay.
And not just living at a level where we're sitting, where we're still learning this as well. But I think that's the piece that I want to make sure. I want a parent to understand what we're doing differently with our fund.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
So ditto from Lacey. All right.
One of the items, too, that I'll just share, and I think we can pull it out as well, some of it kind of crosses over. For example, one of the solutions that we're looking at for communications is a program called Let's Talk, which would be in the technology side, because it's a software package which allows the community to have quicker and faster access to information. And so we've been looking at that solution. It would be under the tech side. But I think, again, we can pull it out and say, here's how this fits within this categorical area that we've said we're looking at strategies to improve. In this case, the example is communications.
That actually brings me to another point, which is great, because I want to make sure we can, again, communicate what the changes are, and that's probably, again, more specific. But I want to make sure at the end of next year that we all can look back at some things like that, a program, and evaluate how well it was, and because since we're creating an increase, and come back to, okay, last year we created an increase in technology, communications, this is an example of it. Should we continue to do that or not? And make sure that we can access that information.
Now, one thing to keep in mind, too, is that, with the budget as it is, so heavily on salaries, because 80% of the district's budget is salaries, there's not going to be like huge dollars amounts that you'll see to these different areas, but there'll be money budgeted for that, so.
Well, I actually think that that's where the money should go to address the priorities, is on salaries. And I don't think that, I don't think that what we're talking about is increase in programs to align with district priorities. I think we're talking about if the strategy is to increase staffing in an area, or to move staff from one part to another to focus on something that's a priority, then that's how it has to be reflected, that we decided that because of X, we're going to shift staff to Y, and the outcome's going to be Z. So, it's not about increasing, it's not about taking a priority area and saying we're going to buy more programs, or we're going to buy more technology, or we're going to buy more, it's all of those different strategies, including staffing, since it's the biggest part of our budget, and aligning that with the priorities, all of those things. And so, I don't know how. I'll be really interested to see how that is broken down and laid out for us. So that, and I think we have to see the other budgets to go along with it. I think we have to see the Title I in particular, and how that fits into it too, so that we can, like Tony said, communicate to the public, we said this is a priority, and here's what we're doing to back that up.
Yeah, but, on some of the staffing, you have to have so many English, math, whatever teachers to be accredited. So, those are things.
I understand.
So those wouldn't necessarily be priority things, or would they?
Anything that is a strategy that addresses some of the priorities is going to be in alignment with the priority-based budget, I would think, even if it's staff that's required. I don't know. Maybe Mark, you can.
Let me see if I can give an example here.
I don't think we have to separate the two, right?
Yeah, I think I can give an example. A year ago, one of the pieces that was part of our big picture of how we improve the district was providing more supports for schools. One of our strategies is having a high-quality principal in every school. Well, the strategy to put the high-quality principal, part of it was creation of the ED positions, the staffing positions that support the development of those principals. So there is a budgetary piece that goes with those 4 individuals and their clerical staff and support staff. So I think that's a pretty good example of here's your priority, here's what it meant for funding. And we also had another department that the needs analysis and strategic plan said we needed more support in buildings, so we put 32 people out of this building into school settings. So that was just kind of a transfer of FTE, but it would be an alignment to what we were trying to accomplish, and so it becomes part of a strategy within the strategic plan that's being funded. The FTE is being funded in a prioritized fashion too to make it happen. So I think that's
a very good example.
Maybe
actually,
one way to look at it.
I was looking more at the 10,000-foot level of $554 million you want to have spread out between all of these priorities, but you're saying more it's like things that we did specifically to address these priorities.
Yeah, maybe some. It's still kind of, I don't think we want to get too far down, but some of the big picture relatable items that we are actively engaging to shift some of the ways we operate as a district as a result of the strategic plan, and then making sure those budgetary requirements follow it.
So you'd like to see a comparison of 14-15 compared to 15-16, what we spent before versus what we're planning to spend this year?
Go ahead, Lily.
Well, I'm wondering if what we're really talking about is related to things that we're doing different, but that align directly to the strategic plan. So those items laid out in the strategic plan that we all voted on and said, okay, this is a priority for us. What did we do different in the budget for this coming year to help accomplish that item that wasn't there before? So it may not be that it may not be that, okay, we had this many FTE before and now we have this many FTE. That may be because of increases in student population and we want to provide, which, yes, that's part of our strategy too, but it may be an item similar to the EDs where that money was directly aligned to this particular strategy. So the example of communications, maybe for the software. So that back to Tony's point, if the community says to us, well, how are you spending your money in alignment to the strategic plan? Well, we already know that, yes, we're going to spend 80% of it on staff, but here are these strategies that we've set forward, and here's how we did some different things in the budget to prioritize that. Does that help, or is that not helpful?
No, I think that is helpful, as long as we're not just, I think that's part of it, and then I think the other part, so it's not just what's different. I think we need what's different and the whole picture. But yeah, and I think that's very helpful.
Okay.
So I think it's a lot of collaboration between your department and everybody else, and who's where it's being spent, so that you don't feel like you're just trying to align it on your own.
I agree. I think
Yeah.
the executive council
Yeah.
would probably be very helpful in that area, so.
So I had to remember which district. I'm looking at Philadelphia right now. I remember somebody telling me that what they do, and this is kind of along the same lines what I'm trying to communicate, is when they're making their recommendation now for their next fiscal year, they started to, as Superintendent Evans shared, identify that priority. They shared what are the examples of the changes that they made, and what they did is then created a pie chart that then said what are the percentage of some of those examples within an area. So if it's curriculum and instruction, and we're talking about a priority area, then they gave you some of the examples. So some of the examples that for the additional resource allocation here was staff development was like a 3% increase, and then they showed support for the school turnaround network was 10%, and then there was other things. But that level of clarity is
Yeah.
different from just this, which we obviously have to have this. They're two, and after you look at their website, they show the high level budget changes what we're talking about, and then this. They're two separate documents, and there's two separate purposes.
No, I think that's a great idea.
So if we can look at some other districts,
Sure.
our research division, to then be able to make sure this is digestible and transparent to our community, and in a culturally responsive and inclusive way, I would really appreciate that
Yep.
before it comes back to us.
I think that's great, yeah. Be happy to do that.
Okay, I did have, Katie, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I had a question related, because I think I heard someone say that the way that we used to do the discretionary funding for each school was based on weightings. And since that discretionary funding is different now, are the weightings, do we use the weightings anymore for anything? Okay. So I'm picturing in my mind, I think it was in the needs assessment. Yeah, it was in the needs assessment that our schools were kind of all over the place as far as relating their free and reduced lunch population to their budgets, and where it should have been, a high free and reduced lunch population probably generally means higher per school allocations and budgets. We were kind of all over the place. And so that was one of those resource equity things that I remember was something we wanted to focus on. So I guess my question is, how is that done now? How is the building level, how are the building level budgets being determined based on the demographics of each building?
That was where when we had the meetings with HR and with the principals, where they would come in and the EDs were in there, and we would discuss, okay, how many teachers do you need? And you need a smaller class size because you're an academy school or a magnet school. So we discussed actual class sizes, because before what we do is we give them an allocation of, like for an elementary, it'd be 20, I think at the time 28 at one time, and now we're down to 24, and then we moved it to 25 to try to even that out a little bit. So, and depending on how the principal would choose to use their funding, sometimes the students at 24-to-1 ratio would give them extra money, and sometimes it wasn't enough. So what we did then was sit down and talk to the principals and the EDs and HR and say, okay, what are your needs? And if you have a higher free-reduced lunch, obviously you need more people, to more teachers, the smaller class sizes. And so that was primarily how that was determined. And then we also used, I can't remember the exact term, but it's like the Tier 1 and the Tier 3 schools, which are the highest poverty in the, and we use those to determine, okay, do you need a full-time kindergarten para or a part-time kindergarten para? And we use just, like a lot of the off-formula allocations, it's like the nursing, for example, we'd bring CIA in for the off-formula stuff, and we'd say, okay, you have a very high population of kids with medical needs, and so we'd make sure they had they normally were okay with their nurses, but we'd make sure that they had the health paras to go along with it. And we just did a lot more tweaking with the actual, just setting, rather than trying to put everybody in a box. We just really sat down and said, okay, how are we going to work these things out and what best suits your school?
It's actually along the same lines. So based on these changes, so I'm looking back at the needs analysis again, because I do remember the inequities we saw along the higher needs schools and versus the amount they're actually getting. And that was one of the big, so that's what you're saying, Ms. Underwood, and I agree. So based on those changes, are we expecting to drastically address the inequities that we saw from the needs analysis? I just want to make sure that we're going to see a different outcome or different graph that isn't lopsided, that shows that our higher needs schools are getting the more funding they need. What I don't want to happen, so I'll let you answer that question, sorry, and I'll add one more, sorry.
Well, you're going to see a change from what was in the past because there were inequities between the buildings. So we tried to just address that with our staffing conferences. But, you may have a building that has 12 paras and another building will only have 2. I mean, based on what the decisions were of the principals and how they wanted to use their funds. So what we're going to do this fall is start talking about PAC paras and talking about library paras and what is needed in a building and what is something that's extra. So we weren't cutting staff at these buildings. We were funding what they had before, unless the principal said that, we don't need that position anymore, you can eliminate that one or whatever. So, as we get further into this, there'll be more, it'll be better as we go along, but we did what we could this year just based on these staffing conferences and what we did for the budgets.
Are those staffing conferences a dramatically different practice from that we used in previous years?
Yeah, in the past, the budget office was not in there, the EDs weren't there. I think it was mostly human resources working with them and figuring out, what they needed. So it is a different approach that we use this year than what they've done in the past.
We didn't do a very large, part of the needs analysis didn't go in depth into sort of a resource allocation analysis of where we're spending our money and how. It did it very generally and then gave a couple percentages, some areas, and see where we are in different ranges, but it didn't get so nitty gritty. When we're looking at other districts that we're embarking on strategic plan processes and are trying to do a lot in a short amount of time, similar to us, have we looked at some of these districts for some new practices for zooming out and identifying systems to make sure our budget allocation is equitable? It sounds like we're doing strategies, but I want to make sure we're not doing just tweaking, and if we can we look at these other districts, identify some practices to potentially adopt over the next couple of years to make sure that we are providing equitable funding to all the schools as quickly and as soon as possible?
Yeah, this was an unusual year because I came in March and we kind of had to do this fairly quickly. And so we haven't had a chance to look at what other districts are doing as far as the equity and all of that, but we will be doing that in the future as we're fine-tuning this. We just made these preliminary changes trying to set the path for doing it differently than what we've done in the past.
Let me see if I can help a little bit too. This is kind of our baseline year, first time we've ever gone school by school by school. We've never done that, where we sat down with budget staff HR staff, Dr. Garnett and her staff were involved in that.
EDs were involved.
The EDs were involved in it, and the principal would also come in. So they walked through their entire staff, and I think they found a lot of surprises.
They did find some.
I think Christy and Janice could probably describe some of those surprises. But it was the first time we've ever done that. We've never walked through them individually, all 88 schools. And so we have information now about needs that we didn't even have before. And we didn't get to the pairs because we actually ran out of time. It's very time consuming to walk. You can imagine the hours with each one of those schools. But we have more knowledge, more baseline information today than we've ever had before. And now we'll continue to tweak that over time as we see needs shifting too, because your needs will shift over time because your demographics shift over time. Things will be shifting even as a result of the SAP could cause some shifting, and you may see a new need for ELL staff because a population shifted, and so now we need to deliver differently in that methodology. You may see a different need in another capacity too. So it should be a moving document and a moving program of individually looking at what are the needs. I think we're closer. I don't think we're there, but we're a heck of a lot closer now than we've ever been because of all the work, and I applaud all the staff behind me. And I sat in through some of them, but they were lengthy conferences, and sometimes there's a little bit of weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, you know, principals are in there, and some of them had made decisions. We didn't even know those decisions had been made, and everybody said, gosh, how does that fit with the priorities? Kind of back to the comment. How does that help us get where we want to go with these priorities? So that was our first really face-to-face look at, is it fitting with those priorities? Is it fitting with the needs of the population you're serving? So I wouldn't say we're there yet, but I would say we're light years from where we were prior to this year. So I
Yeah.
think that helps a little bit.
And another thing you have to keep in mind too is, you know, we had the salary increases for the teachers, and then we had, you know, these staffing conferences and all that. And so we knew we had to keep the budget at a certain level. So there's, you know, certainly many things that we'd like to do in addition to what we've got here. But, you know, you are limited by how much funding you have, and you kind of have to balance all the different parts to get the budget out. So
That's make sure we're telling the right story, because again, the needs analysis, I'm just trying to make sure, yes, our per pupil expenditures are not closely correlated to schools' free and reduced lunch rates. And if we can't tell a story even around what we're going to do differently the next year, now that we have you, which is fantastic, and now that we are beginning to look at this budget, if we can't tell that story, I don't want to not tell that story. I think that's what we have to do as a board.
Yep, I think that's great.
Is the process you described a regression model? Is that what we're doing? Well, the reason I say that is because it says in our student assignment, our needs assessment, you have a 3-part formula. The district is going to continue to refine the process for assigning weights. And this year, which would have been this year, we'll use a regression model for the first time to assign weights as a way to smooth out funding differences across similarly situated schools. And so to me, when I read that, it doesn't say get rid of the weight system. It says use the regression model after this year to figure out what worked and what didn't work, but continue to use it. And I'm just concerned that if we don't have a formula that everybody can clearly understand, it becomes very subjective.
But there was obviously an issue with the formula that we were using.
But the issue, according to the experts that put together our needs analysis, was the weights in the formula. That's why we were supposed to use a regression model to back out what should be in the formula, but never to move away from weighted formula, because there needs to be a weighted formula so we can easily explain to people this is how we break down our budget as far as students and what are the costs. Otherwise, it becomes really subjective if we're sitting down with people and saying, here's your needs in your building. I think there needs to be some of that, but if we don't have I just thought we were doing this, and now I'm hearing that we moved completely away from the weighted student formula.
Yeah, I would say we did not use any weightings in this approach that we had.
So, sorry, I made the assumption that we were still using weighting, but that we were using the conversations to guide it. Yeah, I'm worried about the subjectivity now that you brought that up. I mean,
Well, because we used what they budgeted the previous year. So, I mean, that's what they were spending the previous year, so we didn't change that. What we did is we met with them and talked about what their needs were in the buildings and what they were spending their funds on. So, I mean, it was more refining what was weighted before.
Okay.
And maybe it's just getting it right first before you do the weightings, because if you continue with the weighting, you'll end up with some kind of inequity that had been inherent in the system before.
but we had an inherent inequity with the formula, and so we based our conversations off that, and then we relied more heavily on our conversations with individuals, which are very subjective, and again, we have a finite amount of money, so there's nothing ensuring that we're addressing the inequity from the previous formula because we're still using it. Having the conversations doesn't address the formula. So this is more of a, I'm not comfortable saying yes to a budget unless we have plans or we're talking about how to address this formula issue that is identified in our needs analysis, because that's what was told what the issue was. The solution wasn't have, at least from my understanding, abandoning the formula and then move to these conversations. So I would like to ask you to come with a plan for how we're going to address the formula problem. If it's changing the formula, looking, again, this is going back, looking at the districts and what they're doing to address the inequity. And this is also just this is a practice that we're seeing across districts. Most states and districts have had to, states are providing these equity plans to the federal government. And many states, I can't remember where ours plans in this, but many states are employing districts to look at their formulas and make sure they're addressing these inequities. Now, I don't know if Nebraska is requiring us to do this, but for me, I actually don't care. I would want us to look at some districts that are doing more progressive things with their formulas and thinking out of the box to honestly address the inequities in the formulas as opposed to abandoning them, so that we can do what we're also doing now, which is having those conversations, but grounded in the right data and the right formula.
And, you know, it wasn't completely subjective because you look at the student population and the class size that they're going to have and how much, you know, staff they need for that building for each of these classes. So it's not like we completely abandoned a weighting system, but it's not like we gave them so much for poverty and so much for ELL students and that type of thing.
No, but if I just give an analogy, it's in the same light when we have our open meetings, or this is an open meeting, and we have open comment, when we have people coming to us and talking, the loudest and the people that are here the most and that are most organized, we do tend to listen to them, and because they're the people that are here. If we have a principal that is advocating for more, I'm sure we're going to listen to them, and if they feel like we have a need in a case. If we have a principal or a school that is not advocating or doesn't feel like they have the case to do it, even though the need might be there, there's blinders on that we can have, and that I'm worried about, having those blinders for the schools that need it the most, that may not have been advocating the most, or have the sort of polished case to be able to make that push. So I want it to be as least subjective as possible.
And, you know, as Mark mentioned earlier, you know, as we fine-tune this process and move forward, those are things that we're going to be looking at, but I guess this is our baseline for now.
It has to be data-driven. It can't be, and I think it was, I think we're going to have to work on this. This is baseline, but it has to be data-driven. And I know if you were looking at high schools, you looked at all the high school, and you looked at free and reduced numbers, you looked at ELL numbers, and I didn't sit through all those meetings, but my guess is you could give some of the criteria that it wasn't the same as public comment where someone just came and talked. It was data-driven. But it needs to be more complete. Don't disagree with that at all. Totally agree. It needs to continue developing and enhancing. I think we're heading in the right direction, but we're not there yet. I think there's work to be done.
Right.
I agree there's work to be done, but I want to make sure that what we're communicating is a plan for how we're going to address that, as opposed to figuring it out as we go. Obviously, you're living in the weeds and you're doing this every single day, and I think the exec committee, and obviously we're doing this every day. But if we can't communicate to the public our plan for addressing something so large that Ms. Underwood mentioned, that was one of the main things that was identified from our needs analysis in regards to our budget, that's the piece where I want to make sure we're communicating a plan forward. That's something I think we should invest in now, before we move forward with anything else.
I guess one of the things that I just want to point out too, though, on the discretionary fund piece and moving that into the budget the way you have was a big part of the needs analysis on just issues related to the discretionary and how everyone was choosing to use that money. And those were all things that when we were campaigning, I mean, I think back to that, and that was a big part of the discussion that we all heard. The other thing that might be helpful is, because I know I think about some of my schools who don't have high need from a poverty standpoint, but it's pretty clear when you look at the spending per student analysis that we do tend to spend more where there's higher need, and I think that becomes really clear. And so from, of course, my schools, I hear, because we're not Title I or because whatever, we are operating on 7-year-old computer equipment or really outdated technology and other things. So I think that maybe it might be helpful to somehow take a look at that per school spending as well. And
one
think
thing we
about that.
found interesting when we were looking at all the buildings is some principals would put a priority on staffing, so they had enough staff for paras and so forth, and others would put it all into technology, and they'd have tons of computers where other schools didn't have very many at all. So there was inequities in how they were allocating their dollars, and so, we just saw like a wide range of things going on in the buildings that we're trying to maybe standardize somewhat.
Right, and I think that was the big piece that came out of the needs analysis and of discussion was how money was being spent into buildings because it was so discretionary. It was creating inequity, not because the money wasn't there. It was creating inequity because of the way the spending was happening. And so I was just thinking back to that piece of the needs analysis, and really that was a big piece of it, was the discretionary needed to change and be specifically stated so that the inequity was maybe reduced.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things you've tried to do. Obviously, we have more work to do, and
Sure.
this is our first year at an attempt of something completely different.
Yeah.
Just going back to that needs analysis, if you notice, one of the big bold headlines, they actually put it in its own piece, was all principals need more support in managing their budgets, making more strategic use of building resources, which this is that first step in helping them really understand, and we'd never done that. So that was that big bold out of the needs analysis that we had to do, help them understand more. And now we're doing significant training. In fact, this week we start new principal training, and a big part of that will be budget conversation.
Right.
And something that we haven't done, and certainly haven't done to the extent we should have, which is why it's reflected in the big bold comment. So we kind of hit those big bold pieces as we're putting all this piece together, but clearly head in the right direction, but still have work to do here. So I think those are all great comments.
Okay, Mr. Wayne.
I also just want to make sure principals have the flexibility. That was also a big headline in the strategic plan, to make sure they can address their student needs. That principal leadership is important, and I think we're starting to support them in the right direction, and it's been long overdue. My question is more about, and it kind of goes with Mrs. Fay, and actually everybody has been talking about Hartman. Like Hartman, for example, was a high poverty school who did not have an assistant principal for a long time because of our numbers. We just have numbers where if you don't have this many students, you don't get an assistant principal. But that goes for students who have, a school district or schools that don't have high poverty either. If they don't have that number, they just don't have an assistant principal. I think next year they're at least the PTA has been told or talked to that they have crossed the number of students, so they might be able to get an assistant principal. But what are we doing in the budget to make sure those schools that have high poverty, we're not just so cut and dry on, you have 300 students, therefore you don't, or you have 400 students, therefore you don't get an assistant principal? Because if you think about it, if just 1 or 2% of those kids act up a day and have to go to the office, I don't know how much time that principal can be in the rooms helping teachers. So how do we manage that, and how do we put that in our budget to make sure that can happen?
No, one of the things that was really helpful this year was having the EDs in the staffing conferences, because they're actually in the buildings and they know what the needs of the buildings are. The principals would talk with them, and then they'd bring it to us as we're building their budgets. So there was, discussion about what, like we talked before, about what the needs of the building are versus what a formula would dictate you have, like, the size of the school and that, for the membership, whether they needed an AP or not, so.
But along those lines, where poverty is increasing in our district, our district is growing, so therefore you would probably need more supervision at the building level. Where are those people coming from? It's not 18 million, because it's probably more than that we're going to need growth to answer those needs. Mm-hmm. So what are we doing in central office and I guess people outside of the building to put them back in buildings? Where are, I won't say cuts, because we're removing people. Is there any more of that going to happen? And if so, how will that be reflected in our budget?
Well, this year, for example, the psychologists are moving out to the buildings. So instead of being located at the central office, they're going to be in the buildings. So, those type of changes.
And the SSLs were pulled out and put into the buildings. And also, if they're a high-poverty school, they're also receiving an IF as an off-formula allocation. We're using the Tier 1 and Tier 3 to kind of help say, okay, you've got a higher poverty, what do you need? And that's where we'd bring the IF, where they don't have to purchase that IF anymore. Now it's off formula. And the same with the SSLs, trying to get them out. And in some cases, we combine the IF and the SSL positions, and those are primarily at the higher poverty schools.
I would like to know how many certificated staff we have who don't actually teach students, and what their roles are to support buildings.
We can get that for you.
And how much that costs.
Okay.
Mrs. Fay.
Just a point of clarification, though, is that librarians, counselors, school psych, who all would you, because that's always a difficult one. I've been in a lot of budget hearings over the years, and is a librarian and a counselor, is that a
I mean, if
teacher?
if we said we had this number of counselors, it would just be these number of but I just kind of want to get a grasp on how many, because I hear people say we have teachers who don't teach, and I would like to know what that means. I like to know the numbers behind that. So if it's 100 counselors who are certificated, it's 100 counselors who are certificated.
Okay.
I just kind of want to have a.
librarians, counselors?
Are they
Yes.
are librarians certificated staff?
Yeah.
Then yeah.
Yeah, they're certificated. So we can do that. I think we've got all those counts on librarians, counselors.
I think,
Assistant principals would be
I think a
included,
lot
too,
of that
certificated
information is on
principals.
Open Book, isn't it? It's all out there on Open Book. So if you wanted to look on Open Book,
But it doesn't break down
it tells you how many people
people. But
and the cost.
for example, dean of students are classified as teachers, but they don't teach.
Right.
So it'll just tell me teachers 8,000. I mean, I'm just saying numbers here, but it doesn't tell me dean of students. Like, they don't teach, but they're classified as a teacher. They may have a different pay. Actually, it'd be easier if it was broken down by pay code. We got that 1 year, 3 years ago, but it was a data dump, and we really didn't quite. Well, nobody's going to look through thousands of pages, but just a high level of those areas.
Okay.
Because I know I've looked too on Open Book, school psychologists, how many there are, and those are all broken out. But I guess I haven't looked at every single category.
Well, and we would have some, like certificated staff, like reading teachers. I mean, they teach, but they're not really a classroom teacher. Literacy coaches, so I'm not
Art
sure.
teachers, art teachers, probably music teachers. How do they fall in?
Yeah, they would be certificated staff as well.
But not classroom teachers.
They teach, though. They teach in classrooms. So, for example, one of the questions I have written down that I want to send is, how much would it cost to have a reading specialist in every school? Like, like if we're targeting elementary reading, back to what Mr. Vargas said earlier, like what would that look like, and where would we have to find $10 million, $5 million, $4 million, maybe it's $1 million, right? But if that's one of our priorities, like how do we have that conversation if we don't know the baseline of that conversation?
Right, and when we budget teaching staff, certificated staff, it's the same average salary. I mean, it's always going to be the 47,000, I think it is this year. So, but as far as being able to pull out, and we can try a pay code and see if it would actually pull out, but like I say, a reading teacher is going to be a certificated teacher, but not have their class periods every day. So, but we can see what we can pull by pay code, if that would be helpful.
I had one other question related to Benson. So where does that piece fall in the information up here? We'd voted for the increase to Benson for the Career Center items.
We paid for the additional staff that they needed for the Career Center, so the salaries and benefits of the staff for the Career Center. And then they've asked, in addition to that, for supplies, medical supplies, that type of thing, and equipment for their labs and so forth. And they've gone and got some grants to help pay for it, and they're doing some fundraising. But as far as district support, we're supporting the staff that needs to be in the Career Center for the coming year.
Okay, thanks. Ms. Fay.
I was just thinking back to the conversation about the weighted formula, and as we move forward with that and how that all, with this being the baseline year and working that out, making sure that that also is in alignment with the priorities so that that can be a part of the explanation. And it's not, I mean, I just think everything has to circle back around to that. So if you present a formula based on this year's data for next year, that you can also point back and say, and the reason we're recommending this weighting at this is because we're trying to address these priorities in the strategic plan.
Yeah, like
So
the
I
tier
just think
one
everything
and-
needs to
yeah.
come back to that. I think that helps us build a case for, why we're doing what we're doing, and then also provides a mechanism for us to be able to come back and see if it did what we wanted it to do.
Okay.
I just don't ever want to get too far from that, It's the anchor, right?
So can you, in the next month or two, or actually the next month if we could try to, if the superintendent either and or you come with the proposal for, what's the plan for addressing the inequities that we identified in the strategic plan, and the connection between our funding formula and how we're going to address that, in addition to some of the new practices we're adopting, and then a timeline for how you plan to implement and study and or make those changes. This way, we don't have to also ask questions about when these changes are going to happen, when. I think that would be fantastic.
We could have something preliminary for you at the next board meeting if you'd like.
Oh, great. And then just one other question separately. I know we've had all these last conversations about the extended school day, and specifically for this next year. What's the additional cost for the extended school day overall? Like, what are we already anticipating and or?
Well, the additional cost for the teaching staff has already been built into the budget because of their salary increases. So they're not being paid additional time for working longer because their salary increase, encompass that. There may be some additional hours for paras for before and after school. We may need more specialists to help with plan time, that type of thing. But we could come up with a number for you of what, may be directly related to the extended school day.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. I mean, I'm sure that's also already on the communications list of things that they're trying to do, which is what's the impact of this going to be on our budget to be able to communicate to our constituents.
Yeah.
And you
when
pointed one out
Yeah,
already.
there's one already in there, yeah.
But there's
more that we can
bits
pull.
and pieces, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about the extended day. Since Nathan Hale, according to the World Herald's report, Nathan Hale and Wilson Focus School are not increasing their day. Is there a savings somewhere in there? Since the
No.
staff cost is the same?
The staff cost would be the same. They already have the salary increase, so there wouldn't be a savings in that regard. I think it,
I'm going to defer to legal counsel because I think there's a contractual agreement with Nathan
Right.
Hale, I think. So I think
That's-
we still may be under that, but I'll defer to Megan for that.
The language right in front of me, but I believe it leaves the flexibility for the district to decide that whether the additional minutes, and so there is, it is a variance, and so it allows for additional work time, and it could be work time, or it could be instructional time. So while it's not increasing the instructional time, teachers are there longer during the day, so their work time is longer at those buildings rather than instructional time, which provides opportunities for different professional development. Depends on the variance. The language is different in each one, and so you need to just kind of look at that. I could provide you more specifics as part of this later, but Conda, it is actually part of the language that it goes to instructional time. So it just kind of depends on the variance. They're all a little bit different, each section. But their work days would be longer. It's just not the instructional day that would be longer.
So but if their contract variance at Nathan Hale, if I remember, is like $340,000 additional cost, but if we're going longer into that time period, then that $340,000 cost should shrink. So let's say it's $100,000 savings. Is that going to be reflected anywhere, or are we even getting that savings?
What I'm saying is they're working longer, so they're being paid for the longer work. So their hours are longer, their instructional day is just not longer. So I have to report, let's say, at one building, we'll say every teacher generally reports from 8:50 to 4:05 for the instructional day, plus they're there 15 minutes before and 20 minutes after. The person at Nathan Hale might need to be there 25 minutes before rather than just the 15, so they're working 10 additional minutes that you wouldn't normally have in another building, and they'd be working more additional minutes afterwards. So their work day is longer than the normal teacher work day would be. And so there's built in, they're actually working a longer day than, say, a teacher at Castellar.
so there wouldn't necessarily be savings there because they're still working the additional hours more than other teachers are. So there's no savings in that regard.
I don't quite follow that because their start and stop time is not changing, according to the World Herald, unless the World Herald got it wrong.
Well, the building start and the instructional time isn't going to change.
But we were paying them to teach an additional class at Nathan Hale. So their instructional time was increased, and that's what we were paying for. It wasn't their work day. They were actually teaching an additional class. But if we extended our day and their class stays the same, that's for a different discussion. I mean, we're only talking, $100,000 probably, so I'm just wondering if that'll be reflected. If it's not, that's an update for a later time.
Okay, sounds good. If there aren't any other specific questions related to the budget, okay, Mrs. Fay.
Just before you're wrapping this up, because I know we have the CEP, I kind of would like to know exactly what's going to come back to us. I've made my own notes, but maybe if Connie could kind of wrap it up, and if you don't hear maybe what it was that you were asking for, we could just make sure we're all clear what it is we're asking to be brought back at the next meeting.
When we meet next time, we're going to talk about the alignment of the budget as we've developed it to the priorities of the board and try to identify those expenditures that would be towards those priorities. And then you also asked for the number of certificated staff that are not teaching. We'll provide that information as well. Is there anything else?
All the budgets, we need to see the grants included in that, I think, not just the general fund. I think that's really, really important. I mean, we're talking about I think it's important to see that was actually a very common criticism of the previous budget process, is that we never saw the whole picture.
Title budgets and grant fund budgets and other types of things.
Yeah, when I say grants, I mean all the federal, everything. Yeah.
Is that,
Well, a lot of the grants, we don't have yet. We have a projected Title I, but we just don't have a lot of the information.
In fact, I think I just got a note today and was on the phone with Mike Casserly. They've got a new ESEA allocation. Senator Burr from North Carolina is suggesting they shift Title I significantly, and that's going to the floor this week. So I'm getting more details. Hopefully I'll be able to ship out to school board today or tomorrow from Mike Casserly. But we don't really know those numbers, and it could be pretty significant if they make some shifts in D.C. with the changes at the U.S. Department of Ed. So I'm hopeful it doesn't impact us that much. I think we're about $24 million, $24 million in Title I alone, for example. But that could be impacted depending on what happens with Senator Burr's amendment to ESA reauthorization.
But we've made decisions. I mean, in the budget, you've talked about money that's being shifted to title. So you can't have the one and not the other. I think we have to be able to see whatever it is we have. I don't think you can say we're going to shift this funding to Title II, but not give us a Title II budget as much as you can. I mean,
Well,
understanding that there are things that are beyond our control that could change that.
Well, in Title II, for example, they have a $1 million carryover from last year, so that's part of the $2 million. And then they've allocated another $1 million to help pay for that. So it's,
I'm just asking for all of it, that's all.
Okay.
What's the timeline or plan when you can come and how we're going to address equity? Sort of basically like a district equity plan that lines. That's not the same thing as what you just described.
Well, I would try to get all of that put together. I'm not sure, how much time that's going to take meeting with everybody. So we'll do our best to give you something to present when we come back. And so it would also address the equity issues that we talked about too.
Great. I just want to make sure to flag that for our president so that we can allocate time for this, so that something that we can look at, review, approve. So that's our plan for how we're going to address the inequities and our formula to make sure that our highest need schools are getting the priority-based budgeting they need.
right, but are you talking about for this year, or you're talking about a timeline over the next
I'm talking about
course of?
What we're planning on doing for this next year, a plan for what we're doing this year to address, and we talked about, obviously there's a budget, but what we're going to do over this next year to address the inequities that Ms. Underwood identified earlier from the needs analysis. What's our plan for doing that, and how we're communicating it to the public?
And then also moving forward that we're going to continue to refine the process and make it better as we go forward. So what we're planning to do in the future as well.
And that's the part where you say refine the process. I want to be able to share a plan for what that means.
Okay.
Yeah, like what refining the process over the next year means. That's that detail.
I think that it might be helpful to take a look at that per student building expenditure, because that does play a significant role. I mean, I think about the students who, I think I have one of the lowest per student spendings at $5,500 versus we have, some elementary schools that are much greater than that. And that clearly is addressing that inequity piece, but that might be helpful in showing that. Okay, Mr. Wayne, and then we're going to move on.
Page 4 of the slide, I walked in on the end of Marion's comments. On page 4, I believe, it has estimated expenditures. Maybe it's page, I can't read the top of that page. That's 3, isn't it? Okay. So, is that title,
Are you talking about?
back one. It was, back one more. It was supposed to be a quick question. Is that federal, is that Title I, that 500,000?
No,
Okay.
it's just for the general fund.
So if we can estimate this, can we estimate all the rest of the other funds we get?
Well, you know, for Title I, for example, they have an estimate of what they think it's going to be, but that, you know, depends on the federal government and what they do, but we can give you what their plan is right now and how they're going to allocate the dollars.
Well, that's, I guess, to the point, is our board, I mean, I think we've asked for this for 4 years, because we always get chunks, and we want to see the overall picture of where all the money is.
Okay.
Thank you. I thought that was really low. That's not what I.
Yeah.
That would be bad. Okay. With that, how about if we move on to CEP, and if you have any additional questions for the finance organization, if you could just get those probably directly to Connie, would that be how you want that to be? Okay, and let's move on to CEP.
Okay. Wanted to talk a little bit about the impact on school funding when we do CEP for the buildings. And I'm sure you guys all know the history of this, but the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act of 2010 created the CEP program, and it provides an alternative to household applications for free and reduced price meals, and it offers all students free meals in high poverty schools. A requirement for participation is that you have a 40% minimum of identified students in the school year prior to implementing CEP, and that you serve free lunches and breakfasts to all students. Household applications for free and reduced price meals are not collected when you're a CEP school. So the standard procedure of what's been done for collecting poverty data historically has been you get the household income applications, and then you get the direct certification students, which include SNAP, if they're in foster care, Head Start, if they're homeless, migrant, runaway, all of those are direct cert students. So the standard procedure is getting the household income applications plus the direct certification. What is done for CEP schools is just using direct certification information. So you no longer have household income applications. Those are not considered. So some things to think about when you're doing this is the potential issues surrounding the absence of the application data, which is the income application, is that the calculated poverty allowance in the current state aid formula uses application counts and direct certification for poverty students. When you have a CEP school, it will only use the direct certification counts. So if you have a difference between the applications and the direct certification, you lose those students in that calculation. Another thing to think about is the anticipated level of federal reimbursement for the CEP program, the non-federal resources you have available, and currently the free or reduced price lunch is the national standard for measuring student poverty. So beginning in 2017-18, when they do the state aid calculation, if it stays the same as it is now, when they calculate poverty students, they're going to use free lunch students as being either the direct certification counts for CEP schools and the free lunch application students for and direct cert for the non-CEP schools, or they use low-income students. So that's a child under 19 living in a household having an adjusted gross income equal to or less than the maximum household income that would qualify a student from a family of 4 for free lunch. So for OPS, what they use for the poverty data is a free lunch student count. So in 2017-18, that's going to change for the CEP schools, and they're only going to use the direct certification students. It's not going to include anybody that had an income application form that they had before. Now, there is an alternative income application form, but that will not be used, currently will not be used in the state aid calculation. So the only use for the alternative application forms is for transportation and for student fee waivers. So the alternative application is not part of the current state aid formula calculation. Yes?
That's for the state. You want to go through the entire thing and then ask questions? Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to show what the impact is currently for the poverty allowance in the state aid formula. Right now, there's 6 elementary schools that participate in the CEP program. And the difference in 2014-15, using that data, the difference between the free lunch students based on applications and direct cert versus only the direct certification students for these 6 schools was 290 students. So if we reduce the poverty students by 290, that ends up costing the general fund $656,923. Now, one thing to consider for OPS is in the past you haven't maximized your poverty allowance, so you're not losing any money here because we're not maximizing it. But as we move forward in the future, if you want to maximize what our poverty is, you have to be mindful of what a CEP school would do to our counts of poverty students that they use in the formula. And also keep in mind the formula can change at any time. They're talking about rewriting the thing and using something different for poverty, but all we have now is what we have, so that we understand what the formula is now, what they're using now, so I can only tell you what the impact is here. So, you know, a lot would rely on what they do in the future in the legislature for this program. So if more schools were added to the CEP, then the gap between the free lunch applications and direct certification versus just direct certification students will continue to grow. The current state aid formula, as it is written now, uses a 3-year average of free lunch students to account for growth in poverty. So if your number of poverty students declines over time because they're not looking at the applications anymore, then that's going to impact, you know, your poverty allowance. A thing to keep in mind too is on for the CEP program, nutrition services, their fund gets reimbursed by the federal government for these meals, and so that fund is not impacted. The general fund is impacted because of the poverty allowance and what this does to the calculation that is currently in law. So a school district may elect to stop CEP at any time that they want to. They notify the state no later than June 30th of the current year that they don't want to do CEP anymore. If a school elects to stop CEP, they can restore their standard meal counting and claiming at any time during the school year or the next year. During the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th years, the school district may elect the higher of the identified student percentage, which is your direct certification, or the prior year number of students participating in CEP. So you have a lot of different options as time goes on with CEP as you go forward. So they're pretty flexible in all of this, but the fact remains that there's still a difference between what is directly certified and what happens with the applications that they currently have based on income. So this is just an example of how CEP works, and basically what it means is if you have a building that has more than 62.5% poverty, you get 100% reimbursement in the Nutrition Services Fund. So yeah, any school that we look at to become a CEP school, we want to make sure that they're at 62.5% because then we get 100% reimbursement. Because they use this free claiming percentage, which means they take the identified students that are directly certified and then they multiply them by 1.6, so they capture the free lunch and the reduced lunch students that would be based on income applications versus direct certification. So that percentage is important. So the function of the 1.6 multiplier that they use for the federal reimbursement is, again, it provides an estimate of the percentage of students eligible for free and reduced meals participating in CEP schools, and that participating schools are guaranteed to receive the same free claiming percentage for 4 years. Now, what the state chose to do this year when they passed, I forget which bill it was, that included CEP schools, was they didn't weight the students. So direct certified students are just what they are. They're not increased to account for free lunch application students. So the current state aid formula uses unadjusted poverty students, and for OPS, our unadjusted poverty students are the free lunch calculated students, which are the free lunch applications plus direct cert, plus for CEP schools, it's only the direct cert students. So what we could do, because this won't be effective until 2017-18, we can propose legislation that would give a weighting or a multiplier to our CEP students so that we capture the free lunch count. The reason the state didn't want to use 1.6 is because they only want free lunch. They don't want free and reduced. So there is also a perception that sometimes those applications aren't accurate because they only do a 2% check on the data for income. So there's a perception that maybe that count is too high. And when I talked to Tammy Berry at the state, she mentioned that, they may be changing how this is calculated, how poverty is looked at or how it's calculated. So I don't know what their plan is, but, that can change in the future. But, sometimes they introduce things and they don't get passed. So that's, something you have to consider as you're moving forward. And then I did do a calculation, and I don't think it's on here, of if we added more CEP schools to the list, and there are approximately 13 schools that could be added that have poverty above 62.5%. And if we did that, we would lose 968 students that currently are on the application form, the income application for the free lunch. So using the same calculation that I did for the 6 schools we currently have, if we added 13 more schools to the CEP program, we would, and if we wanted to maximize our poverty allowance as we move forward, we'd lose about $2.3 million just for doing that. But we do have a couple of years to try to get some changes into the legislation, and it's kind of whatever happens during the session, what they want to do and what the priority is. So
I was going to start us off here. I know that you have mentioned to us that you feel very comfortable maximizing our poverty allowance, which is, I think, something that we've all talked about. I have been contacted by others from who are aware of how other states are handling this, and they are using that alternative income form, and other states are being very effective in doing that. However, the state of Nebraska has not chosen to move in that direction yet, and I think that's part of the legislative piece. So I guess the other thing that I would like to ask, I know that tomorrow is the deadline for submitting legislative issues to the School Board Association for the state for the legislative conference. So I would ask that, I thought it was the 7th. I thought it was the 7th in the one email that I read. So I guess I would just, so I guess I would ask first that our folks on that committee maybe submit that as something to discuss at the Nebraska School Board, because I think the more support we can get, and I know I sent an email out this morning encouraging another advocacy group to be supportive of legislative change so that we can move in the same direction as other states who have more fully implemented CEP, but we're not, as a state,
going there, yeah.
There yet, correct?
Yeah, and one of the issues too is with Title I, we wouldn't lose the amount of funding we get for Title I, but if you become a CEP school, you can't get Title I funding. So some of these high poverty districts may have been identified as a Title I school that we'd have to reallocate to a different school. We'd still district-wide get the same amount, but it wouldn't go to that particular school.
Correct. So, Mr. Vargas.
Thank you, Ms. Cotting. It's something that you mentioned. I just wanted to make sure I'm clear on our plan. Are we taking advantage of the ability to use those alternative income surveys to supplement and make sure we're getting an accurate measurement of students that are eligible that are not already identified?
Yes, we are taking advantage of that. We are collecting alternative application forms. That's part of the enrollment process. It's an online thing that they're going to be doing. So we will be capturing that information. It's just that it will not be used for the state aid calculation currently.
And it's not used for state income, that's because of the state, or?
Yes, it's because of the law.
Okay, sorry, I was under the assumption, I can't remember which bill it was, I know the bills that passed recently, that
Yeah.
you can use it, but it's not going to be used for the,
And I think you followed up, you followed up with Tammy Berry, so
Yeah.
we have confirmed that
Yes.
it is not.
Yeah, I followed up with nutrition, the nutrition services of NDE, and also with the Senator Sullivan's office, and also with the people that do the state aid calculation, to make sure that I understood exactly how this was going to work in the formula. And, reading the legislation, it's kind of hard to pull some of that stuff out, but
No.
once they kind of explain it to you and how they're doing the calculation and what's going to come out of it, that's how it was explained to me.
yeah, sorry, I was confused, because I can't remember, it was Iowa, I think Iowa uses it, right? They use the workaround.
Yeah.
I can't
They
remember.
do. Des Moines uses it, and Council Bluffs also uses it. But Council Bluffs and Des Moines both use the alternative income form, but the state allows that.
So I just wanted you to be mindful of what the impact of some of this is, and then, it's up to you to decide how you want to proceed, but you do have a year to possibly get some legislation changed before we're impacted negatively by it.
So is that,
Oh, no,
go ahead, please.
sorry, you were looking the other direction. I was just going to take advantage. On slide, I think it was 6, where we were looking at poverty data. So, starting with 17, 18, even with I guess I'm asking, even factoring in the current CEP schools, our free lunch student number is still going to be larger than the low income number?
Yes, our free lunch student count is higher than the low-income number.
Okay.
And, it didn't impact you this year because you didn't maximize the poverty allowance. But if you had maximized it, then it would have had an impact because of the difference between the direct certification and the income applications.
What work have we done to look at how Title I, by not receiving Title I funds, what impact it has? Because the 6 schools who are CEP then are not getting Title I, is that what you just said?
That's my understanding with how the CEP program would work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it got allocated to other schools?
Yes.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions related to CEP? And I guess it's something for us to process through.
Yeah.
As
We do
far as-
have a list of the schools that would be eligible and what their poverty percentages are, but if you would like that.
So maybe we'll bring that back as an information item to a board meeting so that we can have a more full discussion about it outside of a workshop. But wanted to make sure that this information was presented to everybody today.
So we're going to get back the information for the school by school, the CEP you mentioned?
So we'll get the information on the 6 schools that currently are CEP, and those will continue on for this next year because we haven't
Yeah, we're planning
We
to
didn't
continue with those 6.
changed that as
We-
of June
yeah,
30th.
We did not.
So those 6 will continue. And then could we also, with the information of the other schools that are eligible, also find out what Title I funding they get as well?
Yes.
So that we could also have a clear understanding of what their impact would be as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Snell.
Could we also get a breakdown of the free lunch student count compared to the other?
Yeah,
So we can kind of.
so you can see what the difference is.
I'm not sure it's necessary to do like a history breakdown, but to kind of see, so in the future, if we realize that they're like similar or close. we can
Yeah,
kinda monitor that.
that's how I came up with the 1.3 multiplier, because if I did that 1.3, then I got close to what our free lunch count is using both income and direct certification. But if you just use direct certification, you lose students in that
Okay.
count.
That'd be great.
Okay, it's July 9th to submit for NASB, not tomorrow. So you have 3 days. July 9th. So that would be great. Thank you, Ms. America. Okay, with that, let the record reflect that the meeting adjourned at 6:50 PM. And thank you very much.